Oh, good morning, protege, or of course, good afternoon to my favorite afternoon class, 8th period. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instruction for Thursday, and it is December 2nd, 2021. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. At this point, everybody, of course, should have your ISN open. You should have already dated your notes, top right-hand corner. It's a new day, it's a new date, therefore it's a new page. Do not go back to the previous set of notes, okay? You're gonna need, again, a blue or black pen. Make certain, again, you have your assignment book out and open so I can walk around and check it as I monitor your progress, checking your note-taking, checking for understanding. Again, you're gonna need multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape, but I'm again gonna repeat, I would prefer you not using it while you're watching the Zoomcast. Your number one priority is to focus on the Zoomcast, listening, observing, and most importantly, taking really good copious notes and not just the main bullet notes. Some of you are doing a really, really good job with adding those additional oral notes, but some of you are not, and we got to get you to that next level. All right. So here we go. Write this down. This is your topic heading. So this is a brand new PowerPoint. This is my second one on World War I, the Great War. And this is called World War I Begins, 1914 through 1918. Now, again, there's going to be times I am going to definitely go a little faster because, again, I know the beauty of these Zoomcasts is if I'm going too quickly, you're in charge, boss. Your job is to simply go pause the Zoomcast, give yourself a chance to catch up with your copious note-taking. If something you missed, stop it, rewind it a little bit, play it again. And I would encourage you to watch these Zoomcasts more than once. It's in your best interest, as long as you take one really good set of notes. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, I love this illustration. These, of course, are soldiers who fought in the Great War, and that's World War I. All right, so here we go. So please write this down. So at the beginning of the war, so remember, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand visiting Sarajevo, Bosnia, its capital, which is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's again assassinated by a young Serbian terrorist by the name of Gavrilo Princip. He was a member of his terrorist organization known as the Black Hand. The goals was real simple. They want to get the Austrians out of Bosnia. They want the Austrians out of the Balkan Peninsula. And basically the Serbs and the Bosnians, the Serbians and the Bosnians would join together, form a brand new country that will be called Yugoslavia. Now, as we know, after the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, it sets off a chain reaction because of that elaborate alliance system. So what should have been a local fight between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, suddenly you've got the Russians getting involved, the Germans are getting involved, the Brits are getting involved, the French are getting involved, and ergo, you have World War I, or as they used to call it in those days, the Great War, because they didn't know there was going to be a sequel 20 years later in World War II. All right, number one. So the first unique feature, you got to establish who are the two sides in this war. And this is traditionally where it's gotten a little bit confusing for kids. Because remember, when I taught you about the alliance system, okay, you had your triple alliance and you had your triple entente. It's going to change a little bit now the war has started. Some parts will be similar, other parts are going to be different. So it's really important that you're able to line everybody up in its appropriate side. All right, number one. So we have what's called the Central Powers. And this is going to be one of your two big sides, if you will, in World War I. By the way, this is a great example of adding an oral note. So draw a line off to the side. The Central Powers in 1914 is going to replace one of the earlier alliances. It was called the Triple Alliance. So the Triple Alliance is going to be replaced by the Central Powers. Make an oral note about that. You're going to have to make that distinction for me. All right. So who are the ringleaders of the Central Powers? Number one, you have Deutschland, Germany. And I would make a little side note again. Germany is definitely the ringleader. They're really kind of calling the shots for the Central Powers. Number two, you've got Austria-Hungary. Remember, they were allies as part of what was called the Triple Alliance. Now we're going to add a new kid to the block. And this new kid on the block is the Ottoman Empire. They also are going to be joining the Central Powers in World War I. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen or to my laptop screen, I love this map. This is one of my favorite maps on World War I. So much going on. So a couple of things. Number one, so let's establish our main Central Powers. You got Deutschland, Germany right here, Austria-Hungary right here, Ottoman Empire right here. Here's another country that's part of the Central Powers. You should make a little side note, Bulgaria. Now we're going to get to the Allied powers in a moment, but I also want to point out to you that when we study World War I, we're going to primarily focus on what's called the Western Front. And this is the Western Front right here. All right, so you see this blue line? Now, at one point, the Western Front is going to extend. See where this red line is? That's about as far west as the Central Powers are going to get. But this is, again, what we call the Western Front. This is what we're going to focus on. It primarily runs through France, cuts through a little bit of Luxembourg right here, and it ends right where Switzerland begins. Switzerland was a neutral country. So yeah, you need to make a mental note, and I would even make a side note in your ISN, the Western Front. We're going to primarily focus on that. That's our main focus. Primarily, again, a little bit of Belgium, a lot of France, cutting through Luxembourg, ending in Switzerland. Now, in addition, you see this red line here? This is called the Eastern Front. So the Eastern Front primarily flows through what was at that time Russia, Germany and Russia will be fighting along the Eastern Front right here. We'll talk about the Eastern Front a little bit. We're going to primarily talk about the Western Front. That's the fighting between Germany and then the French, the Brits, and then later on the Americans. However, there are other fronts besides the Western Front, the main focus that we're going to focus on, and the Eastern Front. You also have, and I would make a little side note, it's what we call the Italian Front. So the Italian Front was right here. It's the fighting between Italy and Austria-Hungary. That's another front. If we had more time, we would talk briefly about the Italian Front. And then finally, the last front we talk about is right over here. It's called the Middle Eastern Front. And that's the fighting what was part of what's called the Ottoman Empire. So 4 major fronts to summarize. The Western Front, that's the main one we're going to focus on. You've got the Eastern Front, that's the fighting between Germany and Russia. You've got the Italian Front, which is right here between Italy and Austria-Hungary. And then you've got the Middle Eastern Front fighting primarily in what's called the Ottoman Empire. Do you need to know all 4 fronts? Yes, you will. But especially, you need to be familiar with what we call right here, that's the Western Front. All right, number 2. So your other major side in World War I is what we call the Allied powers. So who are the Allied powers? Number 1, so you have Great Britain. They're a major player with the Allied powers. Number 2, France. France is another major player in the Allied powers. Number 3, you have Mother Russia, another major player in the Allied powers. And by the way, at this point, you should draw an arrow, kind of combine these 3 countries together. So the Allied powers are in essence replacing that earlier alliance, and it was called the Triple Entente or Entente, E-N-T-E-N-T-E. Write that down. Yeah, you need to know that. Oh, we're going to add somebody else in, Italy. And by the way, you should make a little side oral note. Italy originally was part of the Triple Alliance. They were originally allies with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but when the war started, they switched sides. And guess what? When World War II commences, later on in the war, Italy's going to do the same thing. They're going to switch sides. So we've talked about who's in. Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, those are your major players. But who's not in at this point? So when you direct your attention up to the overhead screen or my laptop screen, this is another great map. So again, whenever you're looking at a map, and we're going to be doing a lot of maps when we do World War I and World War II and then the Cold War, you got to look at right here. This is called your key. The key unlocks the mystery to the map. You like that? So you have your Allied powers in kind of that green color. So you've got France, you've got the Russian Empire, you've got Great Britain right here, you've got Italy. But you had other countries that are part of the Allied powers. Romania, you have Serbia, you have Greece, and you got Portugal. Not, by the way, then of course you have your Central Powers, which we've already talked about. You've got the German Empire, Germany, Deutschland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, and then Bulgaria here. And I want to point out to you, you have your neutral countries. So way up over here, you have your Scandinavian countries. You have Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Yeah, I would make an oral note off to the side. They are neutral. Pause the Zoomcast if you need to. Switzerland, neutral. Netherlands, very significant. They're neutral. Originally, again, they were kind of allied with, if you will, with, of course, the Triple Alliance. And by the way, notice that Belgium was allied with the Allied powers, but that's going to be a little later on. Initially, Belgium was actually neutral when the war originally started. So a little bit of a shift here. So again, you notice that you've got your Central Powers are basically surrounded by your Allied powers. And by the way, if you're Germany, you're in a tough situation because you're going to be fighting on two fronts. That means you're going to be fighting here along the Western Front, and you're going to be fighting here along the Eastern Front, which means you have to split your troops, split your supplies, split your generals, your officers, and you're going to weaken yourself on both sides. So it's really important you clearly establish the two sides. So ladies and gentlemen, let's continue on. So this is unique feature number 2. So at the beginning of the war, the country we were going to really focus on is Germany, Deutschland. And the Germans realized at the beginning of the war, they were not statistically, but strategically, that's the word I'm looking for. Strategically, they're in trouble because they realized they're fighting on two fronts. They're going to be fighting against the French and eventually the Brits, and then later on the Amerikanskis on the Western Front, and they're fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. So the Germans realized, number one, they're going to have to mobilize quickly. And they're going to have to mobilize. Mobilize, again, just to draw a line off to the side, mobilize means basically prepare for war. So as you mobilize, you're preparing for war. You better do this quickly because they're going to have to really focus their attention initially on beating the French. Then in their mind, the next unique feature is then what Germany would do is they would focus their attention on fighting in the Eastern Front, fighting against Mother Russia. Now, I mentioned the Brits earlier. What the Germans were hoping is they would maybe negotiate with the Brits and they wouldn't have to fight them. So knock the French out of the war on the Western Front, focus your undivided attention on the Russians on the Eastern Front. And from the German perspective, they thought they could have World War I, there we go, a little alliteration there, within a couple of months, definitely by the holiday season. Now, please write this down. So what are the keys to success if you're Germany, if you want to win this war? And I got to tell you guys, the Germans came awfully close on several occasions. Very easily, the outcome of World War I could have been very different. It could have been a German victory, a Central Power victory. And by the way, another thing about World War I, don't compare the Germans of World War I with the Nazis in World War II. Two completely different perspectives, different countries, different peoples. Number one of the keys to success that the Germans realize if they're going to win this war is you're going to have to strike first. That's number one, meaning the Germans are going to have to take the fight to the French initially and then later to the Russians. Number two, another thing that the Germans came to realize, that they realized that they would have to emphasize a couple of key features if they wanted to win this war in a relatively short period of time, maybe a couple of months. Number one, they would have to use the element of speed. They're going to win this war. They're going to have to do it really, really fast. And number two, the other thing they're going to need to be able to do is they're going to have to do this by using the element of surprise. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, there's that map that I really, really like again. So again, here's Germany. You're fighting on two fronts. You're fighting here along the Western Front and here along the Eastern Front. So you're going to have to mobilize quickly, knock the French out of the war, hopefully from the German point of view, negotiate with the Brits. You don't have to fight them, and then focus your undivided attention here along the Eastern Front, defeat Russia, and you hopefully from the German perspective, you'll have this war won in a couple of months. All right, I want you guys to write this down. I'm going to pull the shade down really quickly, too much glare. So the story is, it's 1914. So in 1914, I'm back again, the Germans are going to implement a new plan. And this new plan is called the Schlieffen Plan. Hey, everybody in your mind say Schlieffen. Oh, you need to know the Schlieffen Plan. You're going to see it on your next assessment, and you're going to see it on the unit assessment right before winter break. So what exactly was the Schlieffen Plan? So you got to go back and do a little digging. You got to go back and research and trace your steps back. All right, number one. So who's the architect? Who's the dude that created the Schlieffen Plan? It's a very famous soldier in German military history. His name was Alfred von Schlieffen. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, take a good look at this photograph, call it a hunch. You're going to be seeing this photograph on your next assessment and the unit exam. His name is Alfred von Schlieffen. All right, so a little background information. Number one, so Alfred von Schlieffen had actually created this plan in 1905. Now, the war started in 1914. So if you do the math, that's 9 years earlier. So 9 years before the start of World War I, Germany was already at this point preparing for a major war. It was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when they'd be going to war with the Triple Entente, now the Allied powers, the French, the Russians, and the Brits as well. So there were two factors that motivated von Schlieffen to create this Schlieffen Plan. Number one, we go back to what you learned about in one of my earlier Zoomcasts, the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Remember, that was the war that was fought between the French and the Prussians, who again will become part of a much bigger country called Germany, Deutschland. The Prussians, the Germans defeat the French. Remember how, as a result of the Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871, the Germans took away Alsace-Lorraine, those two territories. They took it away from, of course, the French. So von Schlieffen knew, draw a line off to the side, the French were looking for revenge. He knew that the day was coming, that the French were preparing for war, and he knew that the day was going to come that they would eventually go to war, and he wanted to be prepared for this. He knew that. He understood the French mindset and how important Alsace-Lorraine was to both the Germans and especially the French. And number two, I draw a line off to the side. In the Franco-Prussian War, one word, trains. You see, the Prussians / the Germans understood the importance of using trains to mobilize troops. They were able to move their troops much faster than the French ever thought. That was one of the biggest reasons why the Prussians / the Germans defeated the French in the Franco-Prussian War. And so you need to emphasize that as well. Speed, mobility, moving your troops quickly. And by the way, you might want to make another little side oral note. You know who the Germans or the Prussians learned this from about the use of trains and moving troops? Us, the United States. They had observers watching how the Union were able to mobilize and move troops quickly to fight the Confederacy. So in some ways, what happened in the Civil War is going to later on motivate the way World War I was waged. There's a connection there. Number two. But another reason why the Schlieffen Plan was created is because Alfred von Schlieffen realized that the Triple Entente, remember that was alliance that was created earlier before the war started between the Brits, you had the French, and you had the Russians. So why would he be concerned about the Triple Entente? Well, it's real simple. Now I would draw a line off to the side. He was concerned, let me see if I can share a map with you. Because if you're Germany right here, look what's happened. As a result of the Triple Entente and now the Central Powers, you're surrounded. To the west, you've got the French and you got Great Britain. To the east, you've got Russia. So that means that you're going to have to, you do not want to fight a two-front war. It's very, very challenging in order to be able to do that. All right, let's get back to the notes. Please write this down. So there were three major parts to the Schlieffen Plan that you guys are going to need to know for your next assessment and for the unit exam, which will be right before winter break commences. So here we go. Number one. So what's going to happen is the German army is going to move quickly. They're going to mobilize quickly. Mobilize means prepare for war. But what von Schlieffen's going to do is he's going to take his army and he's going to actually split it in half into two parts. We're going to call each part a wing. He's going to move quickly because he realizes that speed is one of the keys to German success. And they're going to launch a full-scale invasion of France before he figures the French are going to invade them. They know, or he knows, that this day is coming pretty quickly. So rather than waiting for the French to attack Germany, because they want back Alsace-Lorraine, which they lost back in 1871, as a result of the Treaty of Frankfurt, which officially ended the Franco-Prussian War. You see the way I'm weaving all this information together? That's how you learn history. You're telling the whole story in order to gain mastery. So here's where it's going to get a little confusing. And I'm going to show you in a second how this plays out. So number one, so he takes the German army, according to the Schlieffen Plan. We're going to split it in half. The left part, or the left wing, is a ruse. It's a decoy. It's not meant to be the main fighting force. So von Schlieffen is going to organize in his plan that the left wing would mobilize right on the border between Germany and France. But this left wing is not going to invade France. It's meant to trick or dupe the French. And I'm going to show you in a moment how this is going to all look. Number two, but here's where the story takes a curious turn. Now what's going to happen is the right wing. So the army's been split in two parts, two wings. The left wing is the decoy. The right wing is actually going to go around the French troops and is going to invade France. But in order to do that, they have to cut through a neutral country, which later on will become part of the Allied powers, and that country is Belgium. Now that takes me to number two. Now this is the other part of the Schlieffen Plan. So in addition, von Schlieffen realized this is a very calculated risk because remember, even though on the map it showed the Netherlands and especially Belgium were Allied powers, but in actuality with Belgium, in actuality, they were originally a neutral country. They were trying to stay out of this. Again, Belgium is only going to join the Allied powers after the war starts and after the Germans invade them. So, but what's going to happen is these two countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, again, are trying to stay out of this. For centuries, they've been caught in the middle between the Germans to the east and the French to the west. Now, von Schlieffen realized that if you cut through both the Netherlands and especially Belgium, you run the risk because these countries are neutral countries. They are not taking sides. And when you cut through and invade a neutral country, it's not going to look well in the court of public opinion. Countries around the world are going to really frown upon this because these were supposed to be countries that are not getting involved. But from von Schlieffen's point of view, he felt it was worth the risk. All right, put your pens down. So if I were doing a straight lecture, I would have you guys come up to the Promethean board. I would share this with you and I would have you do a brainstorming activity. But because, again, of the pandemic, we're going to have to improvise. All right, so here we go. Put your pens down. Germany, Deutschland, right here, okay? France, right over here. Way up over here, this is Belgium right here. So this is basically your border between Germany and France. So you notice that you've got these red lines here. See this right here? This is supposed to represent the left wing. So the German forces in the left wing are going to mobilize right on the border between France and Germany. Von Schlieffen knew that as soon as these German troops started marching and mobilizing along the border of France, the French would freak out. And it's exactly what they did. So the French are going to take their troops and they're going to quickly mobilize their troops right on the border between Germany and France, anticipating that the Germans are going to invade here, just like they did with the Franco-Prussian War. Little secret, that's not what the Germans are going to do. Now you see these lines up over here? This is called the right wing. And so what the right wing is going to do is this is your main German force. So they're going to cut through. This is Belgium up here, okay? They're going to cut through Belgium. Now they're in northern France. So you see these blue lines? This represents the French troops. So the German troops are going to go around the French troops. And notice where they're going. See this right here? That's Paris. That's your capital of France. So the Germans are hoping to capture the capital of France, which is Paris. And by the time these French troops here realized that the German troops just went around them, it would be too late, because once, in essence, capture your enemy's capital, for all intents and purposes, you've lost the war. So that's the way the Schlieffen Plan was set up to carry out. Now remember, this is 1905. This is 9 years before the Germans actually tried to implement and execute this plan in 1914. Let's continue on. So that takes me to the third major part of the Schlieffen Plan. So remember, you're splitting your troops in half. Left wing decoy, right wing's main fighting force. You're going to cut through neutral countries, Netherlands, but especially Belgium, to get to France, go around the German troops, capture Paris, the capital, before the French even knew what hit them. At that point, the French would have to sue for peace, and that takes me to number 3. So now what's going to happen is, now that France is knocked out of the war, the Germans then would try to negotiate with the Brits. They are not interested in fighting the Brits. And now what's going to happen is Germany is going to focus its undivided attention on fighting its big enemy besides the French. And that, of course, is going to be Mother Russia. And that is fighting along what we call the Eastern Fronts. So if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, you see this blue line right here? This is Russia over here, okay? This is Germany, Deutschland over here. So this is what the Germans are trying to do. They knock the French out of the war, focus their attention on fighting the Russians in the Eastern Front, and in their mind, maybe by late autumn, early winter of 1914, this would prove to be a German victory. Will it play out that way? We'll see. All right, let's continue on. So I want you guys to write this down. So it's now August, it's early August, and it's 1914. So as a result of the Schlieffen Plan, 1905, so this is 9 years later, the Germans attempt to carry out and execute what's called the Schlieffen Plan. And Germany is going to launch a full-scale invasion of a neutral country called Belgium. Now, why is this important? I'm going to dovetail back to something that I alluded to earlier. Number 1, write this down. Please remember that when Deutschland, German forces invaded Belgium, understand that Belgium was a neutral country. And when you are a neutral country, other countries are expected to uphold and recognize that neutrality. In other words, hands off. The Germans now have invaded this country, and ostensibly they're taking it over. And trust me, this isn't going to be looking really good through the eyes and the lens of the rest of the world. And that takes me to number 2. This was the risk the Germans were willing to take. Now, they knew that by invading this neutral country in Belgium, they understood that their actions are going to greatly disturb and offend a neutral country, a country that the Germans do not want to see getting involved in World War I. And in particular, when Germany invaded Belgium, it greatly upset the current president of the United States of America. Now, remember, I'm going back in history almost basically 20 some years before we talked previously about the Great Depression. We're going back 20 years before the Great Depression started. And that, of course, is the United States of America. The Germans do not want to get the Americans involved in this war. Let them stay neutral. And now you're greatly upsetting and you're greatly antagonizing our American president at the time. And the American president, of course, is Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was greatly disturbed by the actions of Germany when they invaded neutral Belgium. So that takes me to number 3. So when the Germans invaded Belgium in August of 1914, there were a lot of whispers and a lot of comments being made about the way German soldiers were treating, or if you prefer, mistreating Belgian civilians. Civilians are simply folks that are not part of the military. They're not in the army. Now, why is this important? Because this is going to kind of set the tone in terms of the way one side in particular perceives and sees another. So a couple of things. Number 1, there were whispers that German soldiers were acting in a very aggressive manner towards Belgian civilians, men, women, and children. And this aggression is going to kind of foreshadow Mr. Podolsky and Mr. Fisk, Mrs. Weinstein word, kind of foreshadowing, setting the tone for the future of the way the Nazis aggressively targeted civilians in World War II. So remember, this is 20 some years before the start of World War II. That doesn't start till 1939. So this is actually almost 25 years earlier. And number two, what you're going to start to notice in early 1914, both sides are accused of doing this. The Central Powers were accused of doing this. The Allied powers were accused of doing this. And this is what we call propaganda. Now, what exactly is propaganda? So I want you guys to draw a line off to the side. So propaganda, and I'm going to get to this illustration in a second. Propaganda, draw a line off to the side, is very simply, it could be a person, a group of people, or it could be a country. And what they're doing is they're basically promoting a specific idea or ideas, a narrative, okay? They're spreading information. And they're spreading information about their enemy. Now, the catch with this information that's being spread, chances are it could be accurate, it could be, but there's a very good chance that this information that's being spread and being disseminated is inaccurate. It's not truthful. That's propaganda. What matters is not so much whether it's true or not. What matters with propaganda is the group you're targeting. You're either A, trying to make your enemy look badly by promoting propaganda, or B, you are trying to win favor of the people that you're trying to gain the support of. So propaganda could be used to promote a cause. Propaganda can also be used to hurt your enemy. And I would definitely mention that as an oral note. All right. Great example of propaganda in World War I. You're going to be writing a reflection on this shortly. So I want everybody to do me a favor, put your pens down for a moment. This was a painting and illustration that appeared in 1914 after, again, Germany had invaded Belgium, a neutral country. Now, if you notice that all the writing is not in English, but I do know what this means, un crime, the crime. So here's what I want you to do. I want everybody to now pause the Zoomcast. This is going to take you a minimum of 5 minutes to write. I'm going to be circulating around the room. So don't be writing 1 or 2 sentences. If I see that, then you're going to have to go back and add on for me, okay? I want a really good paragraph. So number one, I want you to thoroughly, for me, in this paragraph, I want you to describe for me all the details that you see in this illustration. Everything you see, I want you to write down for me. Describe it. And then number two, this is what you're going to write about at the end of this paragraph, 5 minutes. I want you to describe for me or tell me, how is this painting, this illustration, an example of propaganda? So let me summarize propaganda again. It's when an individual, a group of people, or a country are taking information and they're spreading it. Chances are the information is not accurate. It's grossly exaggerated. It's not truthful. And you're doing it and you're spreading this information for one of two reasons. One, you're doing it to make yourself look better, to support your own cause. Or two, you're spreading this inaccurate information because you're trying to hurt your enemy. So how is this illustration an example of what we call propaganda? I would like for you to explain it for me in 5 minutes. And by the way, as you're writing this reflection for the next 5 minutes, I will tell you a little secret right now. The Germans adamantly denied that this actually happened. This illustration that was supposed to be a painting of German forces in Belgium, okay? The Germans denied that this ever happened. It doesn't matter. because when people saw this painting, in their mind, they had a very strong perception of what the German soldiers were about and what they were actually doing in Belgium itself. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just introduce one other thing to you. So what I'd like you to now do, I'm going to continue on now. You've already paused the Zoomcast for about 5 minutes. So let's just continue on. So now we're in the month of September. And it's September and it's 1914. So in September of 1914, the Germans, now remember, they had gone around French forces along the border between Germany and France. Remember, the left wing acted like a ruse as a decoy. The right wing went around those French forces, cut through neutral Belgium, invaded it, and now occupy it for the next 4 years. And now they have launched a full-scale invasion of France. So let me share with you some key points regarding this. Number one, so this is what we call the very first Battle of the Marne. There were actually 2 battles fought along the Marne River in France, one in 1914 and one in 1918. I'm only going to have time to teach you about the first one. So this was a battle that took place over 6 days. It was fought from September 6th through the 12th of 1914. And by the way, I would draw a line off to the side. This is your first major significant battle of the Western Front. There was actually a major battle fought before this one, but it was fought along the Eastern Front. It was called the Battle of Tannenberg Forest. And yes, write this down. You might as well just write it down again. So yes, the first Battle of the Marne, this is really important. This is going to be your very first important significant battle that was fought along the Western Front. So we're reinforcing this information. So who is the German commander that was in charge of these forces? You know what I think we're going to do? I think we'll save it for my next Zoomcast. So I think we'll stop here. That was a lot of information, especially since you wrote that 5-minute reflection on that example of propaganda in terms of the way the German army and the German soldiers were being portrayed. It was a very effective means of propaganda. So at this point, I want everybody to take out your correctable tape. You are going to go and you're going to clean up anything that you crossed out or traced over. No crossing out, no tracing over. This is a portfolio of your absolute best effort. Number 2, I need multiple colored highlighters. Remember, tip of the tip. Don't be highlighting entire sentences. That's coloring. Highlighting is a reading skill. It's metacognition. Metacognition is the process of thinking about what you're reading. And when you're highlighting, you are naturally and organically studying. And that's how you develop mastery as you are telling the story. Remember, everybody's required to review these notes 10 to 15 minutes every day. You practice for basketball, you practice for cricket, you practice for swimming. Why are you not practicing for school every single day? It's no different whether you want to become a great basketball player or you want to become a great student. You got to work at it. When you go home, take the opportunity. Hand your ISN to your mom or dad, maybe an older brother or sister. Maybe you're having an aunt or an uncle visiting your home that I taught many, many decades ago. And you be your inner Mr. Bonk. Channel it. You teach them the information. Talk about the 2 sides of the war. Who are the Central Powers? Who are the Allied Powers? What 2 alliances did the Central and Allied Powers replace? The Central Powers replaced whom? The Triple Alliance, Triple Entente, and the Allied Powers. Did it replace the Triple Alliance or Triple Entente? Who were some of the more famous neutral countries? By the way, Spain was a neutral country. 1918, you have what's called the Spanish influenza outbreak. You know why they call it Spanish flu? Not because it started in Spain, but because the Spanish press was allowed to write about it because the other countries fighting in World War I, their presses were censored. They were not allowed to talk about this pandemic that was breaking out. The Spanish press reported on it and said, hey, we've got a major outbreak of this very virulent form of flu, and that's why we call it the Spanish pandemic or the Spanish influenza outbreak. Talk again about why the Germans have to create this master plan to win the war. What was the Schlieffen Plan? What do we mean by the two wings and splitting your troops? What was the danger for Germany cutting through a neutral country like Belgium? And again, when they end up in France, you're setting the wheels into motion for the very first significant battle of World War I in the Western Front, and that's the Battle of the Marne, which I will teach you about in my next Zoomcast, talking about the German commander and talking about the French commander as well. So again, I hope you enjoyed today's Zoomcast as much as I enjoyed creating and making it. Again, as I always like to say, the story may have ended today, but you better believe that the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.